Greetings, Dr. Mark Winson here from the Department of Criminal Justice at the University of Central Florida, and in this video I'd like to discuss hate crime legislation. I'll be relying primarily on an article by Bills and Vaughn published in 2022 titled "A Contemporary Review of Hate Crime Legislation in the United States," published in the Criminal Justice Policy Review. And I'll go ahead and I'll put that reference in the comment section so you have that available. One of the interesting features whenever we're dealing with any crime is looking at the laws and how those laws change over time, but also how they vary in different states, how they vary between states and federal government. And when we focus our attention on hate crimes, we want to look at who are considered to be protected groups, and also what acts are considered to be hate crimes. A lot of times I talk to people and they say, well, this happened, is that a hate crime? And sometimes it's easy to say whether it is or it isn't. Other times it's more ambiguous, or we need additional information. And of course, the definitions vary, as I mentioned, and everything changes. And so sometimes it's difficult to keep up with these changes. But for those that are working in the field, my guess is that you will be focusing on the state where you're working, or if you're working at the federal level, obviously the federal statutes. Since I happen to be in Florida, I would be more in tune with the Florida laws. And if I was in California, I would be more in tune with the California laws. Of course, if you're doing research, you may do cross comparisons, or look at the variations between the states. And that's what we end up getting in this excellent article, and provides a wealth of information. And of course, one of the things we'll see is that an article like this has to be updated as the laws change, obviously. But it's an excellent model to follow now and in future research. So if we look at some of the federal laws, and we've discussed these in our textbook, the Hate Crime Statistics Act 1990, the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act 1994, the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act 2009, and the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act 2021, and we'll get into more detail on that a little bit later. That's a relatively new one. If we look back at the history of hate crime laws, really we can we might start in 1978 with the California hate crime laws and see how other states followed those models. And most states, as I mentioned, have hate crime laws, but they tend to vary. And if you look at the COVID-19 Hate Crime Act of 2021, just to kind of summarize some of it, reading from the actual Hate Crime Act, this bill requires a designated officer or employee of the Department of Justice, DOJ, to facilitate the expedited review of hate crimes and reports of hate crimes. DOJ must issue guidance for state, local, and tribal law enforcement agencies on establishing online hate crime reporting processes, collecting data, and so on. And so we get a lot of information here about what would be required. And there's other parts of that law as well. Probably instead of having me read it to you, you want to go ahead and investigate it on your own if you have that interest. And one part that's kind of interesting is additionally, and this is to quote from the law, additionally, DOJ and the Department of Health and Human Services must issue guidance aimed at raising awareness of hate crimes during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we get that into play as well. So very important recent addition to hate crime laws. I also, in my PowerPoint presentation, I have the Florida hate crime law as of 2021. What I would recommend, of course, is that you look at your particular state and see what that says. Just to read some of it to give you an idea, the governor, and again I'm quoting from the hate crime law for Florida, the governor, through the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, shall collect and disseminate data on incidents of criminal acts and evidence prejudice based on race, religion, ethnicity, color, ancestry, sexual orientation, or national origin. All law enforcement agencies shall report monthly to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement concerning such offenses in such form and in such manner as prescribed by rules adopted by the department. And so again, we see a lot related to defining protected groups, but also in data collection, which is a very important part throughout our country and basically throughout the world. To try to have a better understanding, we need to collect data. So there's a lot of debates about hate crime laws and what groups to include, what groups not to include. And a lot of the debates, as these authors point out, focus on, for example, regarding law enforcement, sexual orientation, gender identity, and homelessness as protected groups. In order to conduct their research, they used Westlaw Legal Research Service, and they collected data about protected classes, hate crime legislation, hate crime policies such as data collection or law enforcement training, hate crime victims' rights, and the expansiveness of hate crime legislation, which is really the number of protected classes and hate crime laws. I'm going to only present a small selection from the findings. If you want a comprehensive picture, I would refer you back to the original article. But looking at protected classes, including Washington, D.C., in regards to race, we see 47 states, religion, 47 states, sexual orientation, 33 states, disability, 32 states, homelessness, 5 states, and law enforcement, 5 states. And in terms of legislative provisions, in terms of mandated data collection, 31 states, and mandated law enforcement training, 13 states. I wanted to back up and to mention, just because you have mandated law enforcement only in 13 states, that in no way should imply that all the other states don't, because many states who may not have mandated law enforcement training, many police departments, sheriff's office, different law enforcement agencies do obtain training regarding hate crimes. And they looked at then states with the most expansive hate crime legislation, and they calculated that based on number of protected groups and number of laws. Washington, D.C. had 16, California 14, Illinois 14, and Louisiana 14. Those were the states with the most expansive hate crime legislation. The states with the least expansive hate crime legislation: Wyoming 0, Indiana 2, South Carolina 3, and Arkansas 4. You can see Florida was not in either of those groups, and I don't have the rankings for the other states. So how do we make sense of all this? Well, I think the big point is that there's a lot of variation between states, and you can decide if you think that's a good thing or a negative thing, or how does that have an effect on the criminal justice system, on identifying hate crimes, on prosecuting hate crimes. And there's also some policy and research implications from this research. First is that there appears to be a need for more training and better reporting. More training and better reporting. Second, more assistance and resources. Third, we need to track changes. And fourth, just because it's not in the law does not mean it doesn't happen. So just because it is not in the law doesn't mean that it doesn't happen, which I already mentioned. And what I would also mention is that the Department of Criminal Justice here at University of Central Florida allowed me a number of years ago to develop this course, this hate crimes course. And a lot of that was based on student feedback, saying, we need a course on hate crimes, we need more information about hate crimes. And so this tries to fill that gap. And I don't have any research available right now on how many programs, throughout the United States, for example, have hate crime courses. But my guess would be that it's going to increase as we see much more attention. It's been a busy couple years for me in regards to media interviews, and I usually do several media interviews a year, and sometimes they're about serial murder, homicide, sex crimes, dog fighting, things like that. But I noticed in the last couple of years I had more interview requests regarding hate crimes, and so whether it was about the Pulse mass murder or anti-Semitic propaganda left at people's driveways in the Central Florida area, or about some mass murders that had occurred as part of hate crimes, part of a hate crime. I was, spent some time doing interviews on the topic. So, of course, becoming familiar with the law is important, but also understanding all the other aspects of determining whether hate crime has occurred or not, and also the ways to go about, depending on your role, documenting, investigating, interviewing, collecting data, and researching. And this wraps up this video. Thank you.